which we are conducting with our partners, the Bruges Group, and of course the Freedom Association, where we're very pleased to be addressed by Allison, the Chief Executive of the Freedom Association, and Stephen Morris, the General Secretary of the Workers of England Union, one of the fastest growing unions in the United Kingdom, and a trade union that's been representing the rights of workers, particularly those who have been suffering as a result of government policies, namely forced vaccinations for NHS workers, which thankfully was abandoned partly through Workers of England Union pressure, and of course representing those in the care home sector who are also facing the sack for similar reasons, and those who have been unfairly, unduly and unreasonably pushed around by employers for instance, not wearing masks or speaking out against the draconian lockdowns, which are of questionable medical efficacy. We'll be also joined later by Bridgen, Member of Parliament for North West Leicestershire, who has been very vocal indeed on many issues, but one particular affecting his constituency, which is the abuse of migrant workers who are brought to the UK, often by people smugglers, and are used in the black economy. This has a devastating effect, not just on those who are forced to work in what is technically slavery by modern British standards and according to the Slavery Act, but also it depreciates wages for those on lower incomes. If we increase the size of the labour force, then of course the value of that labour will correspondingly be reduced. It's basic economics, and this is what's been happening in the UK. Many politicians, businesses, be that Tony Blair of the former Labour Prime Minister, they were very keen to build a low wage economy. And indeed, Lord Rose, the chairman of the Remain campaign, did indeed argue that if we left the European Union, it would have an effect of reducing immigration, which would increase wages for the least well off, which he argued to the House of Commons would be a bad thing. But there are absolutely real instances where people have rights which are railroaded and thoroughly ignored. We speak about this quite often in other nations around the world and highlight it, and rightly so. But we also, unfortunately, seem to ignore what's happening in Britain, what is happening in the United Kingdom, and how many people indeed are suffering as a result of this and kept in illegal occupations, kept in employment unethically and illegally. We now have Bridgen who will be joining us, and we will start with Andrew, who of course is Member of Parliament for North West Leicestershire and is really one of the few members of Parliament, indeed possibly the only Member of Parliament, that has been willing to speak out on this issue, the issue of how people, particularly in Mr. Bridgen's constituency, are being forced into labour and forced into employment in grounds which are thoroughly illegal and has the devastating effect which I mentioned. So first of all, without no further ado, I'd very much like to go over to Bridgen, Member of Parliament for North West Leicestershire, Leicester.
Good afternoon. I would point out, Robert, that it's not going on in my constituency. I would never tolerate modern slavery happening in North West Leicestershire. It's in the city of Leicester. I've been approached over a number of years, and I was initially approached because the constituents in Leicester had no confidence that of going to their own elected councillors or MPs, because they'd presided for so many years, decades, over the abuse of labour in that city. And in fact, you've got a full subculture, when I looked into it, of many thousands of people employed in the garment industry, producing goods which, when you analyse the goods and the sale price, there's absolutely no way that the fabric could be bought and all the labour could be conducted in the UK for the prices that they were being sold at. And it was a whole subculture across. And I would point out that the the sweatshop factories were all in an old enemy of mine's seat of Leicester East, Keith Vaz, the cocaine and rent boys scandal MP, who's still a member of the Labour Party, despite also being found to have been bullying and harassing members of the staff in Parliament. He's banned from Parliament ever having a former member's pass. And he was found guilty of the same crimes as John Bercow. John Bercow was suspended from the Labour Party. Despite everything, Keith Vaz is still a member and is still active in the constituency in Leicester East. So there's a whole subculture there. And the black economy, which I'm sure is not just in Leicester, but it is predominantly in Leicester with regard to the biggest concentration of the garment industry. When illegal migrants come into the country, they will try to claim asylum, and they'll, with the help of lawyers, they'll appeal and appeal. But when their final appeal ends, that's the time when they then abscond and they go to their least favoured option, which is to move into the black economy, become an illegal worker, of which there are many, many, many within the UK, hundreds and hundreds of thousands probably. They have no workers' rights. They obviously, I've spoken to these individuals. They live in overcrowded accommodation, sometimes 30 of them in a 2-bedroom terraced house in Leicester. So basically every room will be full of just beds on the floor. The deposits will be taken by the landlord. The landlord knows they're illegal, so they'll never get the deposits back. They never complain. They've got no one they can complain to. They have no rights. They have no rights in their accommodation. They have no recourse to poor working conditions. And they have no recourse to not being paid the national minimum wage. And clearly, the more, as a developing country, we improve workers' standards by improving the minimum wage, that offers a bigger incentive than for people to undercut that in the black economy for the financial gains which they will make. I have been very disappointed with the government's response to uncovering all of this in the city of Leicester. It's what we call Leicester's dirty secret, and it's not that secret. I think it was the Labour deputy mayor that followed me on Sky News once, and he was challenged with the question. Andrew Bridgen says it's an open secret in Leicester that there's a black economy employing people at a fraction of the minimum wage, and he got a bit flustered and he said, well, it's not really a secret, it's just open. And that was an admission from the Labour deputy mayor of Leicester that everybody in Leicester knows what's been going on. It's been going on for a very long time. There has been a bit of a panic over the investigations by the Inland Revenue and Border Force and various people. And what we've uncovered now is the latest scam to get around the minimum wage rules is that they actually are now paying minimum wage to the staff, but they pay them 6 weeks in arrears. And on the day they transfer the money into their bank account with all the wage slips matching up with the minimum wage, they have to go to the cash point machine and bring half the money back to the employer in cash. And if they don't do that, they're summarily dismissed and the employer keeps the last 6 weeks' wages as compensation. So as fast as we try and crack down on this, I mean, there are very obviously financial incentives for these criminals to continue their vile trade. And a lot of the people they're dealing with have got no recourse to justice because they are, in fact, illegal migrants. And I'm absolutely convinced that if there wasn't this subculture, a big part of the pull factor to get people coming here illegally would disappear, because there's no final readout that you just abscond and move into our black economy. And as far as illegal migration, its effect, its corrosive effect on wages, and these companies operating in this way, they're not only not paying their taxes and not paying the proper taxes for their employees and treating them properly, they're actually putting out of business legitimate businesses who are doing things by the book and abiding by the law. So it's really is a double whammy in that they're preventing the tax take and corroding industries. It's very interesting that Boohoo's chief executive, John Little, I think he used to be the chief exec of Matalan. And probably about 15 years ago, he wrote to all, as chief exec of Matalan, he wrote to all the manufacturing businesses in Leicester and said that morally we can't buy off you anymore, because if you can match the prices from the Far East, you clearly can't be abiding by UK rules and the UK laws. So therefore we just can't source from Leicester. The same man 10 years later became the chief exec of Boohoo, and they were quite happy to source considerable amounts of their UK supply from the same companies in Leicester. And I don't think the minimum wage had gone down in the last 15 years. So I just really can't see how that could in any way be supported. And there will be some interesting news I'll be coming out with on this matter, which I can't disclose at this meeting, but it's going to be a bit of an eye-opener. So I haven't given up on this project. I'm disappointed with the support I've had from government overall, and clearly there's a vested interest in Leicester to keep it all covered up and keep everything going.
Thank you, Andrew. That's most enlightening, but also deeply alarming about the practices that happen in Leicester and the attempts to get around employment law, and indeed many of the protections that have been brought in to make sure that people aren't exploited in their employment. Why do you think it is the case that the members of Parliament for Leicester, where this is often happening, you mentioned one former MP, but there's other MPs who are prominent from the Labour Party that aren't indeed talking about this issue, aren't highlighting what is going on? Why do you think that is?
Well, I think Keith Vance still holds a huge sway over Leicester. Although he's no longer an MP, I'm absolutely convinced that next year he'll be standing as City Mayor. It is in Leicester East, his old constituency, where he was the MP for like 33 years or 32 years before I finally got him out of Parliament. And, you know, he's a figure, a major player in the Labour Party. I think Liz Kendall in Leicester West, I think she's now probably not going to stand at the next election. I think she's got a partner in France. I think she's got a new baby. I have not seen her in Parliament for many, many, many months. I don't think she's coming back, and I don't think she'll be standing at the next election. And John Ashworth is the Labour MP for Leicester South. He's been very silent on this issue. Give her a due, when I don't give her much due, Claudia Webb, who will probably be kicked out of Parliament, Keith Vance's successor in Leicester East. She did speak out at the time, and she said that she was contacted by a lot of constituents who are being paid £2, £3.50 an hour. Well, at the end of the day, she won't be an MP probably after the 19th of May when her appeal hearing is heard. I think she'll be recalled, and we'll be having a by-election in Leicester East. So they've all got their own reasons, but I mean, at the end of the day, the City Council, Leicester is a Labour fiefdom. I think until last year, we hadn't got a single Conservative councillor out of 52. We managed to get one in last year, and we just missed one a few months ago. But it's a complete Labour fiefdom. And if you look, it's very interesting. If you look at the disclosure and the interests of some of those Labour councillors, they own lots of properties in Leicester which they rent out. And as I've pointed out to you, the easiest people to rent houses out to with no problems, no complaints, and the best income stream are not necessarily those that we'd want. I mean, during the COVID lockdown, I was told by someone who worked in public health in Leicester that they did visit one household in Leicester East. So there were 32 residents in a 2-bedroom terraced house, and they were all COVID positive, as it would be when you've only got one kitchen and one bathroom between 32 adults all living in one house. But what disappoints me is, you know, why the landlord, and they know who he was or she was, wasn't sanctioned for having an overcrowded house, but it never happens in Leicester. It's a bit like when I moaned about the sweatshops to the city council, and they will just say, well, we never have any complaints from anybody working in those places. Well, they're not going to, are they? That's the whole point. And it's interesting that the sweatshops, when I investigated it, I mean, they're dilapidated buildings, are actually mostly condemned. Now, so things like the Imperial Typewriter Factory, a huge business in the 70s and 80s, and now partitioned up into dozens and dozens of small units doing clothing, absolute fire risk. I find out that they actually pay more rent on those dilapidated units than you would normal commercial rents, and that's baffling until you find out that's because they get access by renting those premises to the pool of slave labour who live in the houses surrounding, and it's sort of that's what they have to do to pay to get in, and clearly those rents are not being spent on maintaining these premises, because if you looked at them you couldn't believe that anyone's still operating in them, because most of the windows are smashed in and there's cardboard shoved against the windows from the inside. It is a real eye-opener, and I'd invite any of your group to go and pay a visit to the Imperial Typewriter Factory premises in Leicester, and you just wouldn't believe that anybody would be working in those premises, and certainly not in Britain in 2022, but they are.
Shocking to hear. We'll be having shortly a question from Kieran McGrath of the Express, who's kindly joined us, a very active journalist in the UK that's highlighted many of these issues as well, and will no doubt like to work with you to do more. Whilst we're just arranging Kieran to speak to us, we will go over to Stephen Morris of the Workers of England Union, who I know need to be leaving shortly to represent people who are facing similar circumstances. And as I mentioned, the Workers of England Union has been incredibly active on issues to do with people being abused in such circumstances and facing what can best be described as oppression in their employment. So before we go back to Andrew Bridgen and also Andrew Allison, who's wrote many articles about this, we'll go over to Stephen Morris of the Workers of England Union. Thank you for joining us, Stephen.
Thank you, Robert. Yeah, just so people are aware, we were set up to go back to being what's called a traditional trade union. So we were set up there to not be bothered in the politics side of it. We're there to represent the members' interests. So what happens is the government sets the legislations or the rules of the game, so to speak, and we just represent the individual. So that's how come we ended up being the only trade union out there representing the care workers, first of all, then NHS staff who didn't want to be vaccinated, and that's why I've got to go shortly. I've got tribunal on vaccine one at 2 o'clock. And people were coming to us saying, well, what's your view on it? And we said, well, we don't have a view other than what's your issue? Let us represent you. All the other trade unions, and we know Unison was for one, said we're not representing anybody who doesn't want to be vaccinated. And then the main trade unions all left their care home sector to its own devices. And just going back to one point you mentioned at the beginning about Lord Rose saying about leaving the EU would drive up wages. Don't forget that it was actually Ed Miliband as Labour leader in 2011 who actually said uncontrolled immigration will drive down wages and the standards of living in this country. So you've got two people there, both on the Labour really supporting EU policy, who do not want better living standards, better wages for the workers. And to me, when it came to the EU referendum, from a trade union point, you'd be saying, them two comments on its own says to every worker, vote leave. You know, it's just because you would. You know, better living standards, better wages, or you vote leave, you're going to get them. Forget all the magic bus stuff, because that was all play on words, as we all know. So we were there representing employees. They came to us and what you do. So we therefore started judicial reviews, and we do know the judiciary has been politicised. It was politicised under Tony Blair, and it's not changed its position now. And so the other trade unions have really lost their way. And that's why we came about, because there is an anomaly out there that people aren't aware of. When you looked around, there was the Scottish TUC, Welsh TUC, Irish TUC, no English one, okay? They were all coordinated. And when the government moved jobs from Portsmouth to Glasgow prior to the Scottish independence referendum, there was only one trade union leader who actually stood up and said, we need to look at protecting workers in England, and that was Bob Crow of the RMT. And all the other trade unions were not mired, because wherever the jobs went, whether it be in England or Scotland, they still got their membership. The other thing is, it's a weird anomaly with the trade union legislations, is that they're all classed as independent trade unions, but they're not. When they're affiliating and they're putting members' money into the Labour Party, they're not independent. And when it comes down to the workplace, the representatives in them workplaces are actually paid for by the company. So where they're going to be sat in front of their own managers arguing for their members, but are they really going to be telling their manager, you've acted unlawfully, you've broke the law, you're actually an idiot? Our reps are not based in the workplace. We actually believe that workplace reps is detrimental to everybody's benefit, both not just the member, but the actual company, because we find with our reps, they can actually look at both sides of the coin. You know, most of our reps have actually been in management at some point, so we can see both sides. They're not all from the so-called shop floor. And so we can actually educate poor managers where the company's not properly educated. And this was very beneficial with the NHS and the care homes, who really didn't know anything about health and safety at work act legislations, what the the care home legislation was all about, what it actually said. So it's about making sure that the reps are properly educated, and we found this was very poor. So, but the other thing is, who actually pays for them representatives in the workplace? What you find is the company are having to pay for their time. And I think that the last one I got, which was to do with Salford a couple of years back, was that the company are having to pay for their time. And I think that the last one I got, which was to do with Salford a couple of years back, was that it was costing Salford Council somewhere in the region of £600,000 a year in lost time. That was taxpayers' money, you know, and yet the trade unions were getting millions of pounds in subscriptions. To me, the trade union reps should not be paid out of council taxpayers' money. It should be paid from the trade union membership fee that they pay. And that's what makes us really different and look at all sides of the coins, is because our reps are only work for us. We don't send any rep into a workplace where they work, because you've got to be independent. And we raised this. There was a House of Lords review a few years back, maybe about 10 years back, where we put in papers to say that the recognition agreement was really detrimental to both the member and the company. One, it really is still a closed shop agreement that's there. It breaks competitive rules, because a member can't go to any trade union to get the same kind of representation. Although we did say it should have a committee rather than each trade union, 10 trade unions in one workplace all going in for 10 different things. It should have a committee and go in with one. So we came about really because of this anomaly of representing workers in England. And I know you've mentioned about the migrant workers, and I remember, I think it was London, they were talking about amnesties, and it's been mentioned quite a few times about amnesties for illegal workers. It's whether you agree in the amnesty or not is one thing, but it's the figure that's important. They're all talking around 500,000 illegal workers in this country. So the argument, and that is people, quite rightly, as Andrew pointed out, they're going to be
no protections at all.
Yeah, they're going to, no checks on them, going to be abused. You can guarantee that the workplaces don't comply with health and safety regulations, and it really is detrimental for it all. But you can guarantee these people, a lot of the people will not be putting into the tax system as well. But they will be claiming tax benefits in some way. they will be claiming either housing or universal credit, or they'll be taking, they'll be getting seen at the NHS or various other, if they can get seen at the NHS. But there's going to be a lot of problems created there. And we have to get this controlled immigration. It has to be controlled. And I know recently, Robert, you was on with Ken Livingstone. There was a couple of points which he mentioned that he's always been a trade union guy, and he's still a member of the T&G. But that, when I first saw that, I thought, really, you should have just hit him and said, well, actually, that shows how out of touch you are. The T&G has not existed for like 12, 13 years. So he clearly doesn't know what's going on. So the issue is we do need to address this immigration thing. But the ones who want more immigration say, well, we haven't got the doctors, we haven't got this, we haven't got that. Well, the whole point of controlled immigration means you control what our country needs, what comes in, whether they're suitable, whether they're qualified. And I do have an issue with, obviously, bringing in doctors and nurses from other places, because they're usually coming from countries that also actually need doctors and nurses. So what you have is a vicious circle. We'll take doctors and nurses from the countries coming to the NHS, but then we'll pay billions of pounds in subsidies to these countries for their healthcare and to try and sort out the problems. And it's a vicious circle that's going on. And to me, we really need to address the problem properly. And that comes down to, actually, if you start to train and our nurses put proper training procedures in place, say, look, this is the university, into university or nursing, care, doctors, then we won't need to take all these doctors from other countries where they need them, you know. And go back to the issue with the care homes. Whilst we were trying to defend workers who were being potentially dismissed because of either not taking the vaccine, of which, bearing in mind, the health minister at the time refused to answer questions from her own backbenchers on whether the Equality Act applied. She actually kept bypassing that question. The government, Priti Patel, said that they were going to give an amnesty for the immigrants who were here, who were still not yet processed, but have been here for 12 months, that they could go and work in the care sector. You know, that's what was being discussed. So really, they knew there was a problem with the care sector, and yet they still went to do it. And obviously, we were kind of vindicated in a way when the High Court came out and said putting all these untested people out the NHS back into the care homes was unlawful. This is what we've been saying all the way along, that it was done wrong. From our point of view, we had to put them all into the Nightingale hospitals because they were isolated units. But yeah, we were. So I'm kind of rushing through a lot of things because I do have to go shortly. But the issue is there's so many things we need to address. But as you said, Robert, at the beginning, the other trade unions, the main trade unions, are now part of the establishment and the problem. They are part of the problem. They're not holding, the whole point of an opposition party is to hold the current government to account. And when you hold somebody to account, they have second thoughts, look at things properly. Are they correct? Are they done properly? The Labour government wanted bigger lockdowns, bigger restrictions. We know they don't work. The unions forced their hand, and the unions weren't representing anybody. And just so people are aware, there's actually approximately 160 trade unions and staff associations in the UK. Less than 50 belong to the TUC. So when you hear about the TUC talking that they represent trade unions, they don't. They are only representing their personal interest. And as long as they keep it's this victim mentality, isn't it? As long as they've got a victim, then they will keep fighting for that. It's this vicious circle. They want to keep a victim, they want to keep a victim. But you have to have good management as well. Just so people are aware, I was actually in retail management for 15 years, did management in various sectors in public transport. So I've seen both sides. And we know there is a balance. You treat your employees right, you get the most out of them. We know they're not all perfect, we know that. And so that means companies still have to have policies in place, you know, to deal with the odd one. So it is a balance, but at the moment we don't have a balance. Trade unions are not representing the workers, the companies are not operating correctly, and health and safety is going right through the roof. And we've seen this now with the yellow card reporting system on vaccines, all the adverse effects, everything we've been saying all the way along. But we go back to the very beginning. A union is there to represent the interest of its member, not its own personal view. And that's what we need to get back to. Thank you. Can't hear you, Robert.
Thank you, Stephen. That was incredibly enlightening, and it's really good to hear that there are trade unions out there that aren't part of the establishment, that aren't that are there to fight for their members and for workers' rights, rather than just the corporate woke trade unions that seem to be on the side of big business against workers, when of course actually trade unions should indeed actually be working with everybody, representing their members, and not being there as corporate tools and to repress and suppress people's human rights, but actually to enhance those that exist and what people should expect to receive when they are in this country, which is a fair treatment, as they should all around the world. Now, of course, we're going over to Kieran McGrath from the Daily Express, who has a question. Of course, Andrew Allison is waiting very patiently. He'll be talking to us, but next will be Kieran McGrath, who has a question for Andrew Bridgen, a Member of Parliament, and indeed, no doubt, perhaps for our other panellists as well. Kieran, over to you. Well, whilst we're waiting for Kieran to address his audio problems, we will go over to Andrew Allison of the Freedom Association, which is an organisation that's been campaigning for, of course, people's freedom, their rights to property rights, and also against the corruption of many of the trade unions that had existed in the UK, which had been there to silence and remove people's freedom, remove people's opportunities, rather than actually to enhance the rights of their workers. But those trade unions that were pushing a political agenda that removes people's the rights that we would expect to have. And Andrew Allison, very much like to hear from you.
Thank you very much, Robert. It's a pleasure to follow Andrew and Stephen. I'm going to start off with my general thoughts on immigration, or legal immigration in particular, and then sort of move on to exploitation and modern slavery. But before I do that, I think there is a myth that's perpetuated by some people on the left, that there are those of us on the right, people who are conservative, libertarian, classical liberals, that we just believe in exploitation. And that they would have you believe that we're only interested in defending big businesses and millionaires, and everybody else can just get trampled on underfoot. Well, I've never met anybody in the Conservative Party who thinks like that, and I haven't met anyone who's a member of the Freedom Association who thinks like that. I believe in a fair day's pay for a fair day's work. I mean, there are market forces at play, which means that not every business can pay higher wages, but that doesn't mean the businesses should be allowed to pay peanuts and exploit its workforce. Now, illegal people trafficking and exploiting those people who are already being exploited is big business. And it's also understandable why people from often poorer and war-torn countries want to come and live and work in the UK. Many of those illegal immigrants that we see on our television screens are making their final journeys from France, and France is a safe country. I can understand why they don't want to remain there for various reasons, but that doesn't mean that we can and should accept an unlimited number of migrants from all over the world. I am skeptical about the government's plan to send illegal immigrants to Rwanda. Just as an aside, on a train recently, there was a man sitting opposite me wearing an Arsenal shirt, and on the sleeve it had "Visit Rwanda" on it. And I did chuckle to myself of how a campaign to increase tourism had basically become a political campaign overnight. Being recorded. But despite my skepticism, I am pleased that the government is finally trying to do something about illegal immigration. After more than 2 years as Home Secretary, Priti Patel apparently said privately, it was reported in the media, that the Home Office was not fit for purpose. I mean, that was some 15 years after John Reid, the then Labour Home Secretary, said exactly the same. But why did it take her more than 2 years to come to that conclusion? I could have told her that, and I wouldn't have charged her a large consultancy fee for relaying the information. Now, Australia has been mentioned a number of times in the immigration debate. So how successful was Australia at processing the applications of illegal asylum seekers who were waiting offshore and coming in by boat? Well, in 2001, the total number of migrants arriving in Australia was 5,561, and John Howard felt that that was too high. So he started this offshore processing policy. A year later, in 2002, one person was allowed into Australia via this route. The figures remained low, but when Kevin Rudd became Prime Minister, he ended the policy, and the numbers started rising again, up to a high of over 20,000 in 2013. Julia Gillard, a Labour Prime Minister, reintroduced the policy, and the figure went down to zero. So the moral of the story really is that if you do wish to end illegal immigration, you have to be proactive. You can't just wish these problems away. So when the government announced its Rwanda policy, no one made that hazardous crossing from France across the English Channel in a dinghy until a couple of weeks ago. Now, I know that the weather has not been good in the Channel, which may explain why no one made that journey. However, even when the weather has not been so good, many have risked their lives in the past. So I think the jury is still out on whether this policy will or will not work. We know that some people arriving illegally into the UK end up working in the black economy, many of them indeed. They can't register for a national insurance number, they can't work legally, they can't register for benefits. So the only way that they can earn a living is by putting themselves into the hands of those people who are going to exploit them. And we've heard some examples earlier in this webinar. If you enter the UK legally, life can be very good. You can be highly successful. But the same cannot be said if you hand over everything you've got into the hands of people smugglers and arrive here illegally. It is clear that in addition to removing illegal immigrants who are men, because the government is only going to remove men from the country and put them to Rwanda, those people with families, those people who've got wives will not be in that position. But there has to be a concerted effort to capture and prosecute the people traffickers who facilitated them traveling to the UK in the most hazardous of ways. As I've said previously, this is a highly profitable business. And I have no doubt that there will be others who will replace those who've been arrested and prosecuted and perhaps jailed for people trafficking. But that is not an excuse to do nothing. But exploitation is not confined to just illegal immigrants. BBC Look North in Leeds did an undercover report, I think around 7 years ago, and it looked at the exploitation of migrant workers in Lincolnshire. Threats of physical violence against those workers were common. Women were told that they could get cash if they had sex with one of the supervisors. If they didn't, then they would no longer have a job. One woman was interviewed and she said that she had a Stanley knife put next to her throat. She reported the offence to the police. But after she reported it, she couldn't find any work. Now, none of those people who were in that report entered the UK illegally. They were migrant workers from Eastern Europe. They're being threatened and they're being forced to hand over a large percentage of their wages as their employers provide their accommodation for them. Now, this is modern slavery. There's no other way of describing it. But it also highlights that it's not just a problem with illegal immigrants. Many perfectly legal immigrants coming in from Eastern Europe have also faced that problem. Everyone should be equal under the law, and everyone committing crimes should face the consequences. And they also should fear the consequences. There should be no no-go areas in our country. Now, I'm sure that if I were operating a sweatshop, paying less than the minimum wage, breaking various health and safety laws, that I wouldn't be in business for very long. The police would raise my premises, they would arrest me. But we all know that the police do not enforce the law equally. Now, I'm not trying to tar all police officers with the same brush, but some do turn a blind eye to crimes committed by certain people in the name of community cohesion and community relations. We have seen this relating to crimes committed by Pakistani Muslim grooming gangs, and it may be very convenient for the police and local politicians to brush these crimes under the carpet, but the decision not to investigate is utterly reprehensible for those raped and those abused by these gangs. So in conclusion, just 4 main bullet points here. We need to seek out, with the help of the friendly governments, the people smugglers. They need to be arrested, they need to be prosecuted, and they need to be jailed for their crimes. Those who make the journey across the English Channel have to realize that they will not be able to stay here. There are legal routes into this country for those who are genuine asylum seekers, those who genuinely fear their lives from oppressive regimes. But we have to make it clear that this country will not welcome those who enter the UK illegally. There has to be no no-go areas for the police. The police's job is to enforce the law equally. Turning a blind eye because it saves hours of paperwork is not an excuse for inaction. But in addition to the police, local government must play its part. When Andrew Bridgen blew the lid on what was going on in sweatshops in Leicester, the initial reaction from the mayor and others at the council was to go on the defensive. And it's not been helped by the Gangmaster and Labour Abuse Authority, the National Crime Agency, the Health and Safety Executive, after that report that they published, I think it was last year, I think, Andrew, where they tried to dance on a pinhead, saying that modern slavery is not taking place, even though it was obvious to everyone that it was. If these problems are to be solved, government agencies, indeed the government and councils, cannot pussyfoot around. Now, finally, I was reminded of something I did, I think, about 10 years ago. And I asked if I could go out with my local police force into Hull City Centre on a Friday night and actually see what their job was like and what they were doing. And I had a conversation with a police sergeant who said to me, you know that we police by consent in this country. You see how many police officers are here in Hull City Centre, and if 200 or 300 people decided that they were all going to kick off at once, there was nothing that we could do. But we trust that the vast majority of people are law-abiding citizens. All they want to do is go out, have a drink, have a good time, get back home again safely. So I think all of us actually need to be those responsible citizens, no matter where we are, no matter whether we're black, we're white, whether we're Muslim, whether we're Christians, whether we're Jews, whether we're atheists, no matter what we are. But when we see wrongdoing going on in our community, it is really up to us to report it. And if the authorities are not taking it seriously, it's up to us to really push it even harder and perhaps get the media involved. So yes, it's government, yes, it's local government, yes, it's the police, but it's also all of us. Thank you.
Thank you, Andrew. That was incredibly enlightening, and thank you for setting the record straight about what's really happening and what we need to do to address these serious problems that are happening in the UK, even as we speak in this modern day and age. And indeed, it should be an important election issue in Britain as we face local elections in just several days' time on the Thursday, the 5th of May. Now, we'll have our questions from Kieran McGrath of the Daily Express, who would like to speak to Mr. Andrew Bridgen, Member of Parliament for North West Leicestershire. Kieran.
Hi, hello, thanks very much for this, and thanks, Andrew. So this clearly addresses an issue which is very much at the heart of Brexit, I would say, something which people were told we would be able to sort of deal with once we left the European Union. You said that you didn't feel that you were getting much support from the government. So one thing I wanted to ask was, do you think the government has been distracted, perhaps since the start of the year, even before, as a result of the Partygate fallout? And is that partly why you submitted your letter of no confidence, because you feel that the government has maybe taken its eye off the ball in this circumstances, and also, what can you outline what you think the government can do to sort of tackle these issues, which it isn't currently doing?
If I start by answering the last bit first and pick up on something that Allison said, he's absolutely right. The job of the police, the enforcement agencies, HMRC, health and safety, local councils, is to enforce regulations and the law equally across all communities. And you can't be surprised if we don't do that, or those agencies tasked with doing it don't do that, that nefarious groups of organised crime will get involved in those communities. So if we decide, for the spurious reason of community cohesion, that a certain community will not be put under those regulations, will not be visited by HMRC and health and safety executive, will not have the police checking on working on any criminality, well, surely, I mean, it doesn't take 5 minutes before organised crime realises that that's the community we need to be operating in, because we'll have relative impunity. So whenever you withdraw, I mean, the example I used to a minister was, if the government were to go completely bonkers tomorrow and say that anyone to do with the manufacture, repair or retail of bicycles were no longer to be visited by HMRC, health and safety or the police, it would take about 3 months before organised crime would be running all of those industries, because that's where they'll gravitate to, because they know they're not going to get investigated. So when we abandon communities and do not impose the law equally, we abandon them to organised crime. And that's what has happened in Leicester, in huge swathes of industry and communities. They've just been abandoned to organised crime. And we haven't done them any favours at all. And in fact, we've made an absolute nightmare. I think we would never have exposed at all what was going on in Leicester, because I had reported it before and it's not been picked up by ministers, unless it had been for the COVID pandemic, where clearly they were still working. They were working in overcrowded conditions. They were living in overcrowded conditions. And that's why the hot spot in the Midlands was, despite all the lockdowns, was areas around the sweatshops in Leicester East, and that is what forced the government actually to do some action. But we have not got to the root of the problem. And quite honestly, even if we close down the whole garment industry in Leicester and stop all that modern slavery, unless we address the issue, there's still a pool of people there who are looking for cash employment and who will be exploited by another industry coming in. It isn't, if we stop one, there's still there vulnerable people to be exploited, and somebody will be out there exploiting them. So there's a lot of work to be done. It may be that the elections next year for mayor, I mean, it is a Labour fiefdom, but I might consider throwing my hat in the ring as a clean up the sleaze in Leicester candidate, and I might end up standing against somebody called Keith Vaz, who's an old sparring partner of mine. I think that if we do, the hustings will be fascinating in that election, and I think it's probably something I'd really consider doing, because I think Leicester deserves so much better than it's got. And of course, if you're on poverty wages, £3 an hour, there isn't the money in the city to fund other businesses to create the regeneration of the critical mass, because there's no future for anybody on wages of £3 and £4 an hour nowadays. That's subsistence wages. There's nothing else for the wider economy. And I'll tell you a little story which will fascinate. My eldest son was a counsellor of mine in northwest Leicestershire, and he went to Leicester University a few years ago. He's still there, and he got a job, an enterprising young man, working in a bar 2 nights a week. And he after a few weeks, he rang me. He said, "Dad, there's something very funny going on in Leicester." And I said, "Well, Alex, you'll have to be more specific than that, because there's many funny things going on in Leicester." And he said, "Well, when I cash the bar up at night for the last few weeks," he said, 25% of all the £20 notes in the till are from Scotland. And I made some inquiries through my contacts in Leicester, and it turned out that the cash was heroin money coming down from Scotland, and that was being laundered through the cash payments through the modern slavery. and that accounted to 25% of the £20 notes for a month that were in circulation in the city of Leicester. You can't get Scottish £20 notes out of a cash point machine in England. They all have to go back to Scotland. And it wasn't the slaves themselves that were spending the money in this bar, so they'd already changed hands once already. That's the size of the problem in Leicester, that the money that was laundered through the slave sweatshops was 25% for a month of all the £20 notes in circulation in the town, in the city. That's absolutely shocking. With regard to, I don't think it's linked to Partygate. I think it's still down to, if we're being very generous, community relations, and we don't step on these people's toes. Ultimately, the sweatshop owners, apart from one that I knew, I found out about, they're generally from the Muslim community in Leicester.
Nevertheless, this is something that we presumably, it's issues like this that the UK can take hold of more, surely, since we've quit the European Union. Is that a reasonable sort of conclusion for me to draw, that we can kind of home in on issues?
Well, what we've got to do, we've got a points-based immigration system. The fact is, we should be having who we want into this country. Immigration, we need immigration. We need people with the right skills and people who are going to assimilate and make a major contribution to our country. The fact is that anyone under who can earn less than about £50,000 a year and pay tax on that money, the simple fact is that that's the level at which you actually are a net contributor to our economy. Okay, we need essential workers, but anyone earning less than about £50,000, when you work out all the NHS and all the costs and everything else, they're not a net payer in, they're a net drawer out. Well, and they're in competition with people we've already got here. And the biggest guarantor of improving of working conditions and labour, the best securer of that, is a strong demand for labour. Well, if you cut off the supply of very keen Eastern European workers coming over here, you're going to improve the living standards for people who are already here. And illegal migration, I mean, it doesn't really affect your life. It doesn't really affect my life. The big competition they have is it's the last group of legal migrants who they're competing for the same jobs, the same overcrowded housing. It's very detrimental to those people, and their chances of getting on in the country isn't really going to affect, for most people in this country, illegal migration means that if they wish to indulge in it, they can get their car cleaned by 5 people at less than the minimum wage. That's a major exploitation as well. Those car washes are, anyone can work out that you can't possibly pay people the minimum wage for the prices they're charging, and you can only imagine the conditions. I would advise anybody never to do that, because all you're doing is continuing something that's pure exploitation. I won't have my car washed at any one of those, and indeed I try and wipe them out in my constituency where they are. I've got the council onto them. Coming back on a couple of things that Stephen said, absolutely right. I've been saying for many years, as far as the NHS goes, we are a very wealthy country. It's immoral for us to take nurses and doctors from countries whose healthcare system aren't up to standard. We should be training at least as many doctors and nurses as we need. We probably should be an exporter of doctors and nurses. But what I'd also bring in is, because it is expensive to train them, I would, and bear in mind that when I went through university, all the medics that I know within 10 years had left to go for very high paid and good jobs in New Zealand, America, Canada, Australia. I would make them sign that when they're trained as a doctor or a nurse, you have to serve so many years in the NHS before you can take your qualifications that this country has helped support you get and go to another country. And if you want to leave earlier, you'd have to repay some of the cost of your training, a bit like the military do. If they train personnel in various skills, they have to sign up to do so many years of service or repay. And I think people would accept that as a reasonable trade-off. And I would say, as far as the Rwandan solution goes, it's there as a deterrent. I would also say that it's my personal information that we would have had a deal with Ghana a year ago on the same terms, and Ghana is the least corrupt country in Africa, and it's a Commonwealth country, but it was leaked out of number 10, and the media backlash against that, the Ghanaians got cold feet and pulled out. We could have been in the situation we are now over a year ago, and I think as long as we follow through, I think it is a huge disincentive. We don't really want to send anyone back to Ghana. It's going to cost us money to do so, but it will be a disincentive. And I can't see people paying £3,000 to a ruthless people trafficker to get over here, knowing that they're going to be going to Ghana. Indeed, I think if we gave them the choice, do you want to go back to France? I think we'd probably find that France is not the dangerous place that that some people would paint it to be. I don't think even the most ardent Francophobe couldn't say that France is not a safe country in which you could claim asylum if you needed it.
One final point, and this is just a point of clarification, and you've retained your letter to Graham Brady remains in, doesn't it? I just wanted to make sure that you still have your you still got your submitted your nothing and no confidence and withdrawn it.
That is between myself and Mr. Brady, but I'm very unhappy about what happened over Partygate and all the fallout from that, and I think it's going to get quite a lot worse. There's no good news on the horizon with that, with more fines to come, and of course the Sue Gray report. I think it's a very difficult situation to be in a position where you set the rules and you broke the rules, I think. Yeah. And I think that's going to be vindicated.
Okay, that's all from me. Thanks very much for that, Andrew. That's brilliant.
Thank you.
Thank you, Kieran, and thank you, Andrew. Kieran, do you have any question for Andrew Allison and on the work of the Freedom Association about what they're doing to tackle this unethical activities and exploitation of people in the UK?
Okay, I mean, I suppose if either wanted to just say what they think needs, if there's maybe one thing that they can think of that the government could do immediately, which would improve the situation. I wonder if there was any specific thing that they think that could happen, a kind of simple point that change that could be made, which might address the current problems.
Well, we've got to do what Andrew said, and I've said it many times over several years. Law enforcement and our regulatory agencies have got to enforce the rules equally across all societies and all industries. Yeah. That's what we've got to do.
And I would have said exactly the same, yeah.
Well, I know Andrew Allison of the Freedom Association, we've got two very brilliant Andrews with us today. I know the Freedom Association have done a lot on this topic, wrote articles, publicised this and try to get the message out there to the media as we are today about what's happening in places. I just either Andrew, of course this is happening in Leicester. What other cities in the UK could this be happening in, and other rural areas? How bad is the problem nationwide?
Well, I think when I first raised it, I think the government, the gangmasters, one of the agencies came back to me and said they thought there were about 25,000 illegal workers in the UK. I mean, that is just such a joke. I mean, there are hundreds of thousands of them, and they're completely vulnerable people. They're bound to be exploited if they're illegal workers, and they know how many asylum seekers, when they've failed their final appeal, just disappear. And they're not going back on dinghies back to France, are they? So they're just disappearing into this subculture. And if we could stamp that out, I think it'd be a major disincentive to people to come here illegally, knowing that they've got a spurious case, because there isn't that subculture to disappear into. And it's a self-fulfilling prophecy that we increase the incentives as we rightly improve living standards in this country, improve the minimum wage. We offer a more of an incentive for people to come in and undercut it with illegal working practices. And so it's going to get worse, not better, as far as I can see.
And I mentioned the cases in Lincolnshire, and I mean, after that particular BBC report was broadcast, I did speak to one of the BBC journalists who compiled it, and I've known that that's been an issue in Lincolnshire for quite some time. So it's not just in big cities, but I mean, I think the point has already been made. Yeah, Andrew made the point just a little bit earlier. When you're buying something, and it's saying that it's produced in the UK, or you're purchasing a service from the UK, and it is so cheap. Well, it can't be true. Well, we all know the reason why it is so cheap. And we do see sort of car washers around all over the place. Like there is a one near me, but they actually, judging by the prices they charge, they must be paying their staff properly because they're not ridiculously cheap. But when you see some some place that says you can get your car washed and your car cleaned inside, and it costs about a tenner, there's no way can it be done for that price. So I think that's a big clue for anybody. If you want to know where this is going on in different parts of the country, just join the dots.
So what would be your guesstimate for how many illegal workers are being exploited in the UK? Would 500,000 be a figure realistic?
It wouldn't surprise me if that's the number.
I'd have said the
Surprise me
hundreds.
at all.
Yeah, I'd have said the hundreds of thousands, but I mean, it's very difficult to gauge because you just don't know. That's the whole point of it. It's all happening under the radar, and it's only occasionally you'll get stories like Andrew has managed to sort of raise very successfully that's happening in Leicester. But where are the other MPs who must have some idea as well in their constituencies where this is going on? I don't know how many emails you receive in an average week, Andrew, but I imagine it's hundreds and hundreds. And I imagine other MPs are receiving exactly the same volume of emails, and there must be things that are going on in their constituencies. There has to be. So MPs can play their part by taking these issues seriously. Well, when they hear about them in their constituencies.
So it could indeed be as many as 500,000 people in the UK that are.
Well, in my experience in Leicester, even the garment industry, Leicester was the biggest, but it's not confined to Leicester. So you've got parts of Lancashire, the old mill towns. I mean, all you need for this subculture to thrive is ethnic minority population to hide your illegals amongst, and access to the clothing industry and probably a history of that. So you've got all the mill towns going up there in Manchester, and I'm sure it's going on there, probably not as concentrated as Leicester, but it will be going on there. It won't be just happening in Leicester. It will be happening in all those communities, unfortunately.
And Andrew, you also mentioned it's a housing issue. I was a councillor in the London Borough of Hounslow for 16 years, and there was a phenomenon that emerged, which we dubbed beds in sheds. There was people who, and you could see this from aerial footage. People working who would be in many industries in my area, because we were close to Heathrow in West London, and the gardens would be full of these tiny sheds where whole families would be housed, literally sheds in gardens with no proper amenities being supplied. People were being charged, as much as £500 a month, which was quite a lot of money several years ago. And we were, as a council, when my party was in charge, when we were running it, and I was indeed on the cabinet of the London Borough of Hounslow, we took action using the planning measures to try and get them removed. And of course, we did face some opposition from some opposition councillors who were claiming that they were there for more than 4 years, which we could prove was indeed the corruption that existed in terms of people abusing the planning process and not following proper planning rules, and then exploiting people, families which are being. So this is not just a question of them people being exploited at their workplace. They can be being exploited at their home, made to live in and pay for absolutely horrendous conditions, and sometimes local authorities.
And of course, they got, because of their status, they got no recourse to complain to the council about their living conditions. No. This is a huge industry. It's people making a lot of money out of all of this, and they've clearly got a vested interest in it carrying on. And when it becomes as endemic as it's become in Leicester, it's actually, they have huge power. They have huge power politically in Leicester, and it's going to take a lot to break it at the end of the day.
So this is essentially organised crime and
it's organised crime. Yes, it's organised crime, and that's as I said, that's what happens. You shouldn't be surprised if you stop applying the law equally across all communities, all industries. If you choose an industry you're not going to do that to, and a community, don't be surprised if organised crime comes in, because they're going to go to the least resistance, and that's where they need to be and operate to act with impunity and outside the law. And of course, then you've got not only people trafficking, prostitution, you've got drug dealing, money laundering. It's all there. It's not Leicester East, Robert. It's the Wild West when you go there. It's the Wild West. You know you're outside the law.
I remember as well, if I just may add, Rob, I was chairing an event a few years ago where Andrew Goulds was a panelist, and he told a story that in Tower Hamlets he got a BBC journalist to knock on a door because apparently there were over 20 people registered to live at that address, and the journalist knocks on the door and asks how many people are living there, and it turns out there's only about 4 or 5. Now there's 2 ways of looking at this. It could be that there's massive electoral fraud going on, and there probably was massive electoral fraud going on in Tower Hamlets. Or it could be that the person who answered the door thought, oh God, these people are after illegal immigrants. No, there's only about 4 or 5 people who are living there. The fact is, you don't know what's actually going on in some of these communities. You've got absolutely no idea.
Well, I suspect in Leicester there is electoral fraud going on. I think if you've got 10, 20 or 30 illegal immigrants in a house, it's obviously going to raise some concerns if no one's registered at that property. So I think, for them to be 10 or 20 postal voters of names of people who no longer exist or moved out a long time ago or are dead, and I'm convinced that certain party in Leicester uses those houses as dead letterboxes for the postal votes. And also I've seen them go through the postal checking system at elections, and those say that those people don't speak English. They've not been taught English. Their mark will be a cross. It'll be the easiest postal vote if you wanted to forge. And if you object to that vote because it's only a cross, then they'll say, well, you're racist. You don't want these people to vote. And I'm convinced that they're using these numerous houses as dead letterboxes for fraudulent postal votes, which is the easiest thing in the world to do.
So it appears, because I addressed this problem with this webinar today with Impact International, because we work at the cutting edge of industry and business and human rights, and trying to address these kind of problems, trying to bring everything together to make sure that business actually serves the interest of human rights and vice versa. That would be good, no doubt, for the economy and the benefit of all. But what appears to be emerging is that there's a situation in the UK today where we have a nexus between people smugglers based in France, but perhaps working internationally, connected.
And of course, Robert, these people who are sold this dream of coming to the UK illegally, they aren't told the working conditions and the pay they're going to be getting. They can be sold a dream, and when they get here, it's a nightmare, and there's no way out for them. And they probably owe the people traffickers money for getting them into the country, and on the wages they're going to ever be paid, they're never ever going to pay that money back. So they never get out of indentured slavery, do they? Because it's not in the interest for the slavers to let them ever earn enough money to ever pay the money back. And we're only talking about people working in the garment industry or car washes. I mean, you can imagine what some of the women will end up being forced to do.
So it's linked to prostitution. It's linked to drugs. The slavery industry in the UK today.
Drug mules, prostitution, modern slavery, etc., etc. And the informant in Leicester who told me about the latest scam with the bringing half your money back in cash to get around the minimum wage rules, and she told me that the boss had addressed the whole factory and said, if you go to the press about this, don't be surprised if when you cross the road your family will get run over. I mean, these are organised criminals, ruthless.
But people
as bad as the people who are smuggling them across the channel in the boats.
These organised criminals could indeed be masquerading as respectable businessmen and active people in the community with links to their local councils, which they're enabling the election fraud to keep them turning
and donations to political campaigns as well.
So the community leader in somewhere like Leicester could indeed be someone who is involved in all these criminal activities, not just the abuse of workers in their textile factories, the garment industry.
They may know the people who are hiring, renting out the houses very lucratively, no complaints, massive rents, all paid in cash, all the way through renting the premises. It's become an embedded subculture, which is very, very hard, and it's got power. And it's a lot of money. It's a huge vested interest, and it's been there for several decades, getting bigger and bigger and bigger. It's a cancer. It's a cancer, and it spreads, and it corrodes genuine and legitimate businesses. You know, I know people who were in the garment industry and got out because you couldn't make a living honestly, and they just despair at what they see going on in Leicester.
It's quite this is quite appalling to hear. You know, we're often told about how people are being abused by in places from, for instance, Sri Lanka or other areas of Southeast Asia. There was a film which parodied Andrew Green and had an Andrew Green type character making such deals. Of course, I don't know if Andrew Green ever did, but we think these things happening abroad. We don't actually realise that they are happening in our.
Also, we have a problem in Leicester of not enough. You know, there may be arranged marriages in families still where one partner will be brought in from the Indian subcontinent. They may have very not recognised qualifications for the UK. They may have very poor or none at all language skills in English. That restricts their ability then to make a living in the UK, and they're basically stuck in that community, and they're also exploited because therefore then they may only be able to earn £3 an hour and not say anything about it, and they all get sucked into the same morass, and they're just, you know, this is a pool that gets the spiraling downwards because there's never enough money in the city to support industries and create economic growth, because you know it's just subsistence wages. It's modern slavery, but it's people who've got few choices and language skills in the city of Leicester, Leicester is the most ethnically diverse city in the UK, and indeed Leicester East, where all these problems are, is the most ethnically diverse constituency in the whole of UK. It's not a coincidence.
So many people laud diversity, and no doubt there's benefits, but this is actually masking is a corrupt industry of people being abused in terms of their housing provision.
Well, it's interesting. You know, Leicester may be a Labour fiefdom, but when I walk down the Golden Mile in Leicester, people recognise me, and a lot of people come up to me and say, "When are you going to get these crooks out of Leicester and do something about it?" And I don't know. I'm thinking about it. I might give it a shot next year at the mayoral campaign. So worth it.
So this should be a bigger issue in the local elections coming up in the United Kingdom.
Well, it doesn't matter whether the media cover it or not. Everybody in Leicester knows what's going on, and they laugh when the government can make reports out that there's not really any modern slavery and exploitation in the city. I mean, there's nobody in Leicester believes that for 1 minute. They know what the truth is, and I think I'd like to lift the yoke of socialism off their shoulders, and it has been a big burden for far too long. And there's no future for the city carrying on voting how it is. All they're going to get is more of the same. And I think people realise that in Leicester now, quite honestly, and they deserve better.
Absolutely. We'll be needing to move on shortly, but we've been rejoined by Stephen Morris from the Workers of England Union, and I just wonder if there's any final statements that Andrew Allison or yourself, Mr. Andrew Bridgen, or Stephen Morris would like to make, or of course our distinguished journalist from the Express, Kieran McGrath, if there's any comments you'd like. First of all, Andrew Allison, your closing thoughts on this dreadful situation in the UK right now.
Well, I'm very much in favour of immigration as long as that we control what's happening, and I think that was the message that we got from the Brexit debates. in 2016. And you know, when I got those messages when I was taking part in debates, when I was out campaigning, when I was doing television stuff. And of course, you know, if somebody comes from, say, from India, for example, as a skilled person, a computer programmer or something like that, wants to come to the UK, well, that person's going to come over here. He's going to have a well-paid job. He's going to be able to support himself, support his family. That isn't a problem. I mean, what we're talking about here, and is criminality, and wherever organized crime can get a foothold in somewhere, it will do it. That's what it's going to do. I mean, interesting what Andrew said about the 25% of the Scottish £20 notes in Leicester. You can see all of this. I will just go back to what I said. I just want to reiterate it again. And that it is up to the government, it's up to councils, it's up to agencies, it's up to the police. You've got to police this and enforce these rules equally right across the whole of the community. And it is everyone's responsibility when they see these sort of things going on to raise these issues. And you know, if you're ignored, well, you shout a bit louder. And if you're ignored again, you keep on. But you just can't keep giving up on this because, you know, by what Andrew says is happening in Leicester, it could be coming to a town or a city near you, if indeed it's not already happening.
Stephen Morris,
your thought?
I agree with the panelists, but the issue is clear from a trade union point. It's the welfare, as we're concerned, of them individuals, and it's how we deal with it. But it's trying to stem the flow of them coming here for this illusion that they're entering a great land of opportunity and suddenly being entrapped in slavery, in modern slavery, you know. But we also have to look at the issue, and we can't hide away from the fact that it is certain communities that we're talking about. We cannot hide our head in the sand and say, well, and we can't restrict the police as well. They cannot have a fear. They have to do what they hold their role to, and that's to police without fear or favour. The problem is they fear going into these communities to address these problems because they will be branded various tags with them. And yet all we want them to do is, it's not racist to make sure that we want these people to be treated fairly and to be looked after and address these problems. You know, UK and England's always been a welcoming country, but let's face it, we are an island. You know, we only have certain limited resources and limited space. And for us, why should these people travel all this way, putting themselves at danger to only arrive in what is potentially a more dangerous scenario for many of them? Because if they don't hand over that cash and they don't do that work, then as Andrew's already pointed out, they have the threat of being killed, you know. And we have a greater responsibility, but we can't hide behind this, oh, it's racist or anything. And I go back to, I'm going back 10 years, and we're going to do a debate with Jeremy Corbyn at Manchester Uni on the failure of multiculturalism. Because one of the things I was highlighting when I was on public transport at the time, I could name along the Manchester tram system every community. It wasn't integrated, it was segregated, it was self-segregated. Right? Every community along the Bury to Alton line, I could name them all. And the issue there was the police wouldn't go into certain communities because of this fear. Let's say, okay, as long as you do your police without fear or favour, let's get in there and let's start to address this, you know, and back up the police. So that's what
Thank you, Stephen. And the final words to yourself, Mr. Andrew Bridgen.
No, I think we've had a good debate, and it comes back down to, you know, equal enforcement of the law across all communities, all industries, and you know, that's what we want. It's not what we're getting now, and we're not doing those communities any favours. It's not racist by doing that. It's actually racist by not doing that, because you're just abandoning these communities and these industries to organised crime, because they're always going to move to the point of least resistance. And when it becomes endemic, you get what you've got now in Leicester. And then when you pull the politics into it as well, perhaps that explains why we've only got one councillor out of 52 in the city of Leicester. It's unhealthy, and we need to shine the light on it. And the answer is for equal enforcement of the law across all communities. And I don't think anyone could ever argue against it.
Well, thank you so much for all that took part. For Stephen Morris, General Secretary of the Workers of England Union. You can find more information on them at workersofengland.co.uk. Thank you to Andrew Allison of the Freedom Association, which is tfa.net, be able to find the Freedom Association across all channels and all the work that they do. The Bruges group as well, you can find on LinkedIn, on Facebook, on Twitter, on Getter, on the internet as the Bruges group.